It's been a busy week on the front to end the war in Ukraine, although an interim 30-day ceasefire has been elusive. President Trump has spoken to both his Russian and Ukrainian counterparts, saying great progress was made. Direct negotiations in Saudi Arabia are just around the corner. And here in Europe, an EU meeting on Thursday, leaders failed to allocate money for Ukraine to maintain its defense against Russian aggression. Meanwhile, the coalition of the willing, a stabilization force to monitor a potential ceasefire, is still determining its scope and division of responsibilities. And now joining me to discuss the current trajectory for Ukraine is career diplomat, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, and former American ambassador to Poland, Ambassador Daniel Fried. Mr. Ambassador, great to see you, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Yes, now I think we point out the failure from yesterday's EU summit to garner 40 billion euros for continued aid to Ukraine, as well as they wanted to get about 5 billion for ammunition. What does this say about the EU's ability to respond to a crisis? And do you believe that this the burden of supporting Ukraine now rests squarely on European shoulders?
Europe has done a lot to support Ukraine. So this setback yesterday was not the first time they've tried to organize munitions for Ukraine, and it won't be the last. It was a setback, but Europe has done a lot, and Europe will continue to do a lot. I think that the Europeans are realizing that it's one thing to state your intentions and another thing to put something together. I think the British, French-led effort to put a force inside Ukraine is the most complicated, and that going from theory to practice will be very difficult, but it is essential, and I think the Europeans have been moving pretty fast, actually. They need to keep moving fast because Trump is driving the negotiating process ahead, and the Europeans had better be ready in case it actually moves. That's under a question mark, of course, because I'm not yet sure that Putin wants it to move at all, but that's a different issue. Europe needs to prepare now and move fast.
Right. Now, with this coalition of the willing, it's to meet in Paris on Thursday. Is aid for Ukraine better in this format, perhaps, in this coalition of the willing, if you will?
Well, there are two separate coalitions for two different tasks. One is to continue European arms flowing to Ukraine. The EU seems to have that, or at least they're trying. That until now, that's been a separate process, was U.S.-led. It's more NATO now, but in any event, the process of getting European arms to Ukraine has to move forward. The second issue is trickier. It's putting in a European force inside Ukraine to back up a ceasefire. Now, French President Macron recently said that Europe shouldn't wait for Russia's permission. He's right, but that will be very hard. In the end, whether putting a couple of brigades inside Ukraine is the best thing to do, or whether Europe might think about something else like serious air defense to protect Ukraine, especially if it moves unilaterally without Russia's permission, those are good discussions to have. But in any event, Europe has said that Russia's attack on Ukraine is a threat to all of them, and if Russia wins, European security will be in jeopardy, even more than it is now. So Europe is right to step up and needs to be prepared to do so.
And meanwhile, depending on who you ask, in terms of success of the summit, European rearmament will move forward, hundreds of billions of euros to be spent. What are the most urgent challenges, do you think, for the Europeans? We hear or we see that there's this 650 billion euro hole that needs to be expeditedly filled for the continent to be ready by the end of the decade.
Europe needs much greater capacity in production of munitions and the big European countries need to be able to field more forces, particularly land forces. My general sense of it is that European air forces are in pretty decent shape, but not the ground forces. Britain can only field one army brigade overseas at a time. That's not enough. Poland is building up fast and is moving in the right direction. They've got a ways to go, but they're ahead of the game. The French, the Germans now have need to do more, and the Germans have cleared away, getting rid of a major hurdle, the debt ceiling. Europe needs to be able to actually field many brigades and to be able to move them fast enough to respond to Russian aggression without waiting for the United States. Now, I don't think Trump will pull out of NATO. I think that he's likely to stay in, especially if the Europeans keep increasing their defense spending. But Europe needs to be able to act in any event. That's critical. And if the mixed signals from Washington and the threat from Putin combine to get Europe to act, well, that may be what it takes. But we need a militarily stronger Europe. And that's ultimately going to be good for transatlantic relations. The Americans need to stop complaining about Europe and needs to start helping Europe with its rearmament. And hopefully, rather than fight about defense industry, the U.S. and Europe would find a way to cooperate and specialize. But that's a slightly different topic.
Right. Well, we have this buy European policy. How do you think that this is going to affect the transatlantic relationship? Will this go down smoothly with a transactional president like Donald Trump?
Well, I'm sure he will complain about it. The trouble is, one, if Europeans are spending their own money on defense, they are going to want to spend it in their own countries, in Europe. Secondly, every time somebody in the Trump administration talks about or hints at withholding American military technology, it means that the argument that Europe needs to rely on itself more and on the U.S. less gains strength, which is just the dumbest sales strategy for American arms I can think of. I just don't understand it. In an ideal world, we'd be able to put tariffs aside and put the various American threats about restricting arms exports aside and start cooperating in ways that make sense. It's a growing pot of money. Europe and the United States ought to be working together to build up their investment in defense, their industrial capacity, so that there's a free world defense industrial base. That would be the ideal. If we don't get there, having a stronger European defense industrial base is a good thing anyway.
All right. Well, career diplomat, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.